Good evening, everyone. My name is Maeve Clark, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Iowa City Public Library. And I would like to welcome you to tonight's program for the Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival Banned Books Week. But before I begin, I would like to thank Teresa Mangum, who is right there, and the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies for the financial support of this evening's program, and for all of the creative assistance from Associate Professor Corey Creekmore. Corey has a joint appointment in the Department of Cinematic Arts, and English, and as soon as I found out what the theme for this year's Banned Book Week was, I called up Corey, and we just ran with it. So, but before we begin tonight, let me tell you a little bit about the Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival. This annual celebration is named for former librarian Carol Spaziani in honor of her 26-year career at the Iowa City Public Library and for her lifelong commitment to freedom of ideas. Carol was just a force in herself in making us understand the importance of intellectual freedom, and not that we didn't want to understand the importance of intellectual freedom, but she really was a force. And so we had always celebrated Banned Books Week, but when she retired, we thought it was an applicable thing to honor her for that. There are several more events during this week's Intellectual Freedom Festival, tonight's program, and then tomorrow morning at 10:30 we have a story hour where the children will be read to from books that have been challenged and banned. That's always exciting. Don't think they quite understand it, but it's a way to teach their parents of the importance of it. Then tomorrow evening at the same time in this room, 7 p.m., we'll be screening Dixie Chicks, Shut Up and Sing. The documentary follows the Dixie Chicks over a period of intense public scrutiny when one of their, Natalie Maines had criticized the President of the United States, George Bush, in England when she was in a concert in 2003, and this is the backlash from that. If you're interested in social media safety, I get to teach a class on it on 10:30 on Friday morning in our computer lab. And then our final event for Intellectual Freedom Festival is Friday evening at 7 p.m. in this very room. And Maureen Freely, the 2014 Ida Beam visiting professor at the University of Iowa International Writing Program, will speak on censorship. She is the president of English Pen. I think that will be very interesting. We'll have a lot of the writers in the International Writing Program here as well. The library is full of displays on banned books. We have a really nifty tablet where you can swipe your way through banned comics, and I think that that's something you might want to explore later on tonight. But I would like to turn this over to Corey, but first, I have a little quiz here. This is the Disappearing Civil Liberties mug. Yes? Yes. Oh, yeah. When you put hot water in it, your civil liberties disappear. And then as it cools, they return. So the winner, you can be a winner if you can tell me when the Bill of Rights was ratified. Come on. Century? Does somebody want to,
Ballpark.
All right, Corey, go with your question.
Oh, I didn't.
All right, I'll go with Corey's question. No, okay, we'll see what happens. What does EC stand for?
No, this crowd they know that.
Come on, somebody raise your hand.
Somebody wants a mug.
EC Comics, what does?
EC.
Oh, yeah.
EC.
But what does the EC stand for?
EC.
EC.
You won one already. Lisa? Do you know the answer? Either. Just help me here. Yes.
Who won?
It's unfair for me to speak, so.
Yes.
Here you go. Really? Yeah. And the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. So
Yes, 1791.
I remember it like yesterday.
Yes.
No, 6 years ago I passed the exam. Come on.
So Corey, here is your mug,
okay,
and you
thank you.
will now do the introduction, please.
well-
educational, the answer to the question, what does EC Comics stand for is,
It circulated. It's
Here.
kind of a trick question because
Corey.
it was educational, and then it became entertaining.
Oh, no, listen, you guessed it. So Corey has to get rid of this. No, but the concept is educational comic was like a protected. Yes, there was protected kids.
Okay. Excuse me if my voice cracks. I had to teach a lecture course just a couple of hours ago, and the microphones died on me, so to a large lecture class, I had to scream to these students, and I think I lost whatever force my voice had. I'm going to repeat some of what Maeve said. Before I introduce Professor Carol Tilley, I want to thank Maeve Clark and the Iowa City Public Library for arranging her visit as part of the 2014 Carol Spaziani Intellectual Freedom Festival, which is being held in conjunction with National Banned Books Week, which this year focuses on comics and graphic novels. I also want to thank Teresa Mangum and the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies for their generous support of this event. Carol Tilley, just the factual part first, is Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she's also affiliated with the Center for Writing Studies. Her work has been published in a number of professional journals, including Information and Culture and Children's Literature and Education, and she's presented her work at many professional conferences. In that regard, her career is impressive and notably academic. One might call it mild-mannered in the ways that some prominent newspaper reporters have been described. She's also appeared at numerous public libraries, including, this impresses me, 48 hours ago, the Brookline Public Library in Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and soon in 72 hours at the Urbana Free Library in Illinois. We're part of her tour. I told her she should have printed up t-shirts, but. However, in addition to her presentations at anticipated, respectable, and perhaps also mild-mannered professional conferences, she's also been a featured speaker at the massive rowdy San Diego Comic-Con, and she's been profiled in the New York Times and other mainstream venues, and featured in the recent documentary Diagram for Delinquents, which was screened here on Monday night. Hardly typical activities for most faculty in any field, although, of course, the discipline of library and information science is more action-packed than most. In fact, at the last Comic-Con, she not only spoke, she did it 5 times for 5 different events. She also spoke last month at Wizard World in Chicago, and next month she will appear at the New York Comic-Con. Sorry, I can feel I'm losing the voice. In my experience, the exceptional figures who move deftly between such distinct worlds, publication in venues with titles like, I love this one, the Journal of the American Society for Information Science and Technology, where she is published, people who publish in such journals on the one hand, and appearances at events with names like Wizard World on the other, they only manage to do this by having secret identities and by changing into flamboyant costumes. Professor Tilley, however, seems to transport herself between these parallel worlds without the need for a convenient phone booth. For you younger people, Google phone booth. Or even a more colorful superhero name. Although then it occurred to me, if she does have a secret identity, well, how would we know? Her superpowers are most obviously her keen intelligence and her super research skills, which have taken her where no scholar has gone before, ... That's a little cliffhanger designed to get you to turn the page or to read the next issue or to stay seated for the lecture to follow. The unusual attention Professor Tilley has received recently is surely due to a number of things, including the fact that she is a dynamic, lively speaker, but also because, as I've hinted, because her research on a number of topics, especially on the work of Dr. Fredric Wertham, the infamous anti-comics crusader of the 1950s, it's been genuinely groundbreaking or game-changing. Without preempting her lecture, I'll just tell you that she found things no one else had ever found before. And believe me, people had looked. And thus a decades-long discussion and debate around both between comics fans and scholars, the audience that she so effectively bridges, has been significantly altered as a result of her research. When Maeve Clark asked me who was the best person to bring to Iowa City for this event, I immediately thought, Carol Tilley, if we can get her, knowing that someone in such demand would be difficult to schedule. So I'm especially delighted to say we got her. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carol Tilley to Iowa City and to the Iowa City Public Library.
May 4th, 1954. Dear Dr. Wertham, I am an 8th grader at North Fulton High. I am 13 years old, and I read comic books. I read your article in Reader's Digest on comic books, and I disagree very heartily. My opinion probably doesn't mean anything to you, because I'm only a child, but I just had to let you know my views. In your article, you claim that comic books, horror, sex, love, crime, etc., increase delinquency. I disagree. I believe those children you spoke of were delinquent before they ever saw a comic book. I have at least 25 friends who read the same kind of comics I do, and of which you speak in your article. I sincerely believe we are all of sound mind, and I very seriously doubt that comic books will injure us. I don't know if you have ever known people, adults, who drank, but I do. The alcohol, I believe, may be good in moderation, and for people who know how and how much to drink, but how about the weak adults who don't know how to drink? Why then outlaw comic books from us who can read them without first doing something about you, the adult's own bad habits? The liquor. Have you ever looked at an adult crime book? Do you really believe that our comic books do more harm than these crime, horror, and sex books written for adults? Do you also plan to put a control over adult crime books, cigarettes, and alcohol? What % of all children reading comics go around killing people? Do you approve of smoking? Does not that injure you more than our comic books? Do you suggest that all children give up comic books, our amusement, and turn now to cigarettes, adult crime and sex books, and liquor, adult amusement? If we did, wouldn't we have a fine US in a few years? No. Until you can answer all my questions to my satisfaction, my friends and I will continue to read comic books. I want you to understand that I am not trying to be rude, but just expressing my views on the subject. I would very much like to know your opinion, and I will await your reply eagerly. Sincerely, Lynn Crawford, Atlanta, Georgia. So this is Lynn, the 13-year-old who wrote to Fredric Wertham, who I will share more about with you this evening. But I want to, while I have this slide up here, just point out a couple of things. I don't know if you can see on the green sheet of paper and a little bit on the red, but you'll notice there's penciled in, it says children's letters, reading, spelling, and then there are some things that are marked. Dr. Fredric Wertham did that. All of the letters he got from kids, he saved, apparently. I found a number of them. And he enjoyed correcting them for spelling and grammar. And he was saving them, I believe, to use in the second edition of his book, Seduction of the Innocent, that he had planned, so he could prove, more forcefully perhaps, that comics really were bad, that they made kids into poor readers and poor spellers. So Lynn's letter was addressed to Fredric Wertham, whose book, Seduction of the Innocent, had just been excerpted in Reader's Digest. And I know some of you already know who Fredric Wertham is. If you don't, you're going to know more before the evening's over. But let me start with just a couple of basics. He was born in 1895 in Germany. He was respected, if temperamental. He got a start in the US in the 1920s at the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic, which was part of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He trained there as a psychiatrist, and he was active in the field of psychiatry until the 1970s, and then he died in 1981. In the 1930s, after working for most of a decade at the Phipps Hospital in Baltimore, Wertham moved to New York City. And he began working at Queens General Hospital and Bellevue, as well as in private practice. For anyone who's interested in 20th century popular culture, children's print culture, especially comics, Fredric Wertham and his book, Seduction of the Innocent, are really a touchstone. This book, and Wertham himself, captured the American public's imagination when it was published in April 1954, 60 years ago this year. I'm fond of quoting C. Wright Mills. Some of you know C. Wright Mills. He was an eminent sociologist in the 20th century. He reviewed Wertham's book for the New York Times, and he called it, quote, a most commendable use of the professional mind in the service of the public. I still have a hard time sort of justifying or understanding that, but that's my problem. The National Education Association that year named Seduction of the Innocent its book of the year and said that parents, teachers, librarians needed to read it. It was that important. In Seduction, Wertham made a stirring call for limitations on the sale of comics to kids. His argument was based on what he said was clinical evidence that he gathered as a psychiatrist over many years of work. And he saw that comics reading was linked detrimentally to juvenile delinquency and general children's welfare. By the 1940s, Wertham was devoting much of his practice to the diagnosis and treatment of young people who had been identified by courts, schools, parents, and others as juvenile delinquents. Now, some of these kids were patients at the Lafargue Clinic, and you see a couple of photos from the Lafargue Clinic here. And that was a clinic in Harlem that was quite groundbreaking. Wertham joined together with some other folks in the mid-1940s to begin this clinic, which was the first of its kind to offer treatment for people of color. Mental health care at that point was quite segregated. And so the fact that you could go, if you were Black or Hispanic or another person of color, you could go and receive treatment by real professionals for a quarter was something quite revolutionary. It was an integrated staff. They had social workers and physicians and others who would help with the treatment. Now, I said that he saw many kids who were juvenile delinquents. He also saw many kids who had a variety of emotional and behavioral disorders. And to some extent, juvenile delinquency and those disorders overlapped at the time. So he saw kids who might be bedwetters, who had nightmares, who had been physically, mentally abused or sexually abused. He might see kids who were truant. He might see kids who were dyslexic, or kids who liked to daydream, or kids who didn't get along with their parents. There were a few kids out of the hundreds that he treated through the Lafargue Clinic and elsewhere who had genuine, what we would consider today, genuine neuroses or psychoses. But those were the exceptions. Probably closer to 80 to 85% of kids had behavioral disorders, kind of the normal growing up kinds of things. But besides classification of delinquency or one of these emotional or behavioral disorders, what almost all of Wertham's young patients shared and what he really sought to understand was their pastime of reading comics. Now, his argument, as it's popularly remembered, is pretty simple. If you read crime comic books, especially if you're a child who reads crime comic books, you will be harmed morally, socially, physically, and mentally. You'll note that he limited his condemnation to crime comic books. And that seems reasonable. There were certainly plenty of crime comics in the 1940s and 50s, things that had crime in the title, or comics called things like Murder Incorporated or Western Killers. But for Wertham, crime comics weren't just those that had crime in big letters on the cover. Instead, crime comics for him were any comics that depicted crime, whether the setting was urban or rural or Western or fantasy, whether it was the realm of supermen, horror, or supernatural beings. So you could be in the midst of a cowboy shootout, you could have a cartoon rabbit punching another cartoon animal. You could even, for instance, have a comic such as a Classics Illustrated comic depicting a famous work of literature like A Tale of Two Cities that in Wertham's mind counted as a crime comic because it depicted crime and violence. Consequently, there was almost no sector of comics publishing that was outside of his purview, outside of his definition of crime comics. He conservatively estimated that maybe 90% of all comics published were crime comics. Wertham viewed the violent content of these comics and other mass media as a real public health concern that demanded regulation. That children encountered violent content in mass media was insidious to his mind because he believed it harmed their ethical development. And this wasn't just a moral issue for Wertham, because for him, the orientation as to what is right and wrong is part of normal mental health. An example I sometimes use is early in Seduction of the Innocent. Wertham loved analogies. He had lots with vaccines and lots with poisonous food or food that had gone bad or spoiled in some way. But near the beginning of Seduction, he talks about kids as plants in a garden. And that's not such an unusual analogy, maybe. He viewed, though, that comics were the pest. They were the blight, the insects, the fungus that would come and eat away and destroy the plants in the garden. And for Wertham, he believed that parents and the other adults in kids' lives should be the proactive gardeners, the gardeners that spray pesticides and herbicides in their gardens before these horrible diseases and blights can degrade and harm the plants, the children. He believed that adults needed to cultivate and care for children to prevent, not treat disease. So this belief fueled Wertham's work with young people and truly secured his popular legacy as an overzealous reformer. He was eager to quash comic books and their publishers in an attempt to save young people from everything from illiteracy and drug addiction and delinquency to mental illness, gang membership, and other certain dooms. And this evening I want to share with you a few stories about Dr. Wertham's war on comics, which culminated with the publication in 1954 of Seduction of the Innocent, as well as the US Senate's hearings on comics that year, and the Comics Code. 1954, for me and for many folks, was the year that comics almost died. Maybe a little dramatic, but I'll go with it. It's comics, hyperbole is encouraged. Along the way, I hope to share with you a little bit about what it meant to be a comics reading kid in the 40s and 50s, as well as a little bit about why Wertham and his ideas still matter 60 years on. But I want to start first with a little bit about comics. I wish I owned all of those first. So comic books as we might recognize them today, even though there were comics from newspapers that had been bound into collections for sale before that, both in hardcover and in floppy, comic books as we really might recognize them today didn't begin until 1936, 7, 38. A lot of people date modern comic books with the appearance of Superman in 1938. At first, readers could find maybe a few dozen comic books on newsstands and in drugstores. By the mid-1940s, that number had climbed to more than 100. Superhero comics dominated the marketplace through World War II, but there were other genres, as you can see, jungle and science fiction, Western. But superhero, adventure, and funny animal titles were the mainstays of what was published in those early years. And there were adults who objected to comics content, to their potential or perceived harmful effects early on. But quite frankly, most adults in the US were a little preoccupied by the war to spend a lot of time worrying about what kids were reading. And so the early objections to comics never reached a critical mass. Now, after the war, you could still find superheroes and funny animal and adventure comics, but publishers also began to introduce new genres such as romance, horror, and true crime. And these genres flourished. There were adults coming back from the war who needed something other than funny animals and superheroes to read. There were kids who were aging as comics readers and wanted something other than superhero and funny animal and Western comics to read. And so some of the new comics that were published were truly intended for an older teen or young adult audience, but that didn't really stop younger kids from reading them. I mean, face it, they look kind of fun, even if they were a little gory and lurid. Young people devoured comics. So by the early 1940s, more than 95% of all elementary-aged school children were comics readers, avid comics readers. It didn't matter whether you were a boy or a girl or white or black or brown or rich or poor, you read comics. And it wasn't just that you read an occasional comic book. Most studies during that time found that the typical kid followed maybe 24 or more comics titles. At the same time, they might follow an equal number of comic strips. It was all comics all the time. By the early 1950s, more than 600 titles could be found on newsstands, which is pretty amazing. And sales of new comics in the US were about 100 million issues a month. That's the annual sales equivalent. If you figure out how many people were then alive in the US, that's the annual sales equivalent of 30 comics per person in the United States. And I think any publisher today would be excited by that. If anything, sales probably shortchanged readership because the pass-through rate, that is how many people touched each comic title, was typically estimated between 5 and 8. Now, given the prevalence of comics readership among young people, it's probably unremarkable that Wertham and his associates at Lafargue took an interest in the phenomenon. But what is remarkable is the fervor with which they took up the study of comics and how quickly Wertham began to denounce comics reading as a malignant pastime. Now, I do want to share a couple of ways the kids were reading comics, and I want to point out too that this center image looks a little bit like a Norman Rockwell painting, but it's not, it's a photograph. And I don't remember the date right offhand, but I've dated some of the comics, and I think it's from 1947 or 1948. But those are real kids and a real newsstand. Now, comics early on provided kids with opportunities to network socially in ways like Facebook do today. So you could find kids requesting pen pals, trading things, sometimes livestock, sometimes wagons, oftentimes telescopes, BB guns, games, books. I'm trying to imagine the kids who had livestock that they wanted to trade, what happened if someone took them up on that. You know, how do you get a cow from North Dakota to Georgia in the mail? There were kids who wrote letters early on. We often think of comics letters pages as being a more modern development, but there were letters pages in a lot of comics from the late 1930s on. There were contests and opportunities. Kids were participating and joining in each other, forming clubs, playing through and with comics. There were toys that were comics related, just as we have toys that are related to Marvel and DC today. You would have found similar kinds of things in the 1940s. There were movie and radio serials that were based on comics characters. You could get clothes that had comics characters emblazoned on them. There were big little books that were tied to comics. So comics were really everywhere all the time. I want to tell you a story just as an aside. I've collected a lot of these pen pal pages and letters pages from the 1930s and 40s. And I occasionally try to track people down, see what happened to them. And I was sitting at home one night looking through one of these lists, and I always look for names that are unusual. You know, the kids who are named Joe Smith are kind of hard to find 70 years later. But in one of the columns, I noticed two young women with Japanese names, and then noticed their addresses. and they were writing for pen pals from one of the internment camps. And then I started noticing more kids who were writing for pen pals from the internment camps. And I had to stop that night because it affected me so much. I can't imagine what it was like to be 10 or 11 and locked away and reaching out through comics pages to have someone to correspond with. Comics early on were spurs for social engagement and community engagement. So the young woman on the left is from Chicago. Her name's Louise Crutcher. And Louise Crutcher was a young African-American woman. She was riding the bus in Chicago one weekend, and she happened to sit next to another child who had some kind of physical disability, had been institutionalized recently. And they began to talk, and through this conversation, Louise realized that there were kids who, like her, who didn't have ways of getting comics. They were in foster homes and hospitals and other kinds of settings. And so Louise went back to her neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, and she began collecting comics. She picked them up. She would tape them back together or staple them back together. She would buy them with her own money. And she set up a lending library in Chicago among kids who were institutionalized. And every Saturday, with her own money, she would travel around, mostly on the south side of Chicago, and visit these places. And if you were a kid on her route, you could request a comic, just like you can from a library today. You can put a reserve or a hold on it, and you could check it out for a week at a time. And she would take requests as well. The boxer Joe Louis at one point gave her a donation of comics to help with her library. There were middle schoolers in the New York City area who were upset that the most prominently featured African-American character in comics in the 1940s was this character on the bottom right named Steamboat. He was a sidekick for Captain Marvel. And Steamboat, as you can see, is maybe a little stereotyped. And these kids, they were an integrated group of kids. They showed up at the Fawcett publishing offices. And they said, look, we think that this is a bad representation. We don't like it. You should stop publishing Steamboat. And the Fawcett editor looked at them and started to argue with them and didn't get very far. And they made their case forcefully enough that Steamboat disappeared from Captain Marvel comics. So kids were finding ways of engaging with comics in kind of cool, unique, proactive ways. But back to Wertham, the good doctor. Beginning in 1948, Wertham became the leading public figure of the American anti-comics movement. He wrote and spoke prolifically on crime comics and their contributions to juvenile delinquency and mental infirmity. You could encounter his message in venues as diverse as magazines like the Saturday Review of Literature and Ladies' Home Journal, or the meetings of the American Prison Association and the Women's National Book Association. He was on the radio a lot. Government groups, including the New York Joint Legislative Committee to Study the Publication of Comics in 1951, and the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in 1954, consulted with Wertham as they undertook discussions related to the effects of comics reading in juvenile delinquency. Wertham's first rant on comics, and it really was a rant, was in December 1947. He was invited to testify at a post office hearing, an obscenity hearing in Washington, D.C. Strangely, he wasn't there to support the prosecution. He was there as a witness for the defense. The publisher that was being charged with obscenity was the publisher of this magazine, Sunshine and Health, which was a nudist magazine. And Wertham appeared. He spent 3 hours on the stand, and he really only talked about Sunshine and Health for about 15 minutes. And the rest of it, he brought some comics with him, and he used the rest of his time on the stand to tell everyone how horrible comics were. Judith Crist, who some of you might know became a famous, well-regarded film critic, was then a beat reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, a young woman. And she wrote about Wertham's testimony for that newspaper. And this is her description. Thumbing through his pile of comic books, Dr. Wertham pointed to one illustration after another. The reader gets the impression that all women are young and pretty and have accentuated breasts. At all times in all locales, they run around barefoot in brasiers and panties. It's obvious to the simplest GI, let alone to psychiatrist, he added parenthetically, that a half-dressed woman is far more enticing than one without clothes. So for Wertham, photography of the human body was okay. He saw that as natural and normal, but he was concerned about the violence, what he sometimes saw as sadomasochistic treatment of women in particular in comics. Judith Crist, by the way, was Wertham's friend and confidant for several years as he developed his case against comics. She pledged her support on more than one occasion. Throughout late 1947 and into 1948, Wertham began compiling massive amounts of intelligence against the comics industry. Much of his early understanding about comics came from Gershon Legman, the man on the left. Some of you may have heard of him before. He described himself as a folklorist and publisher, and he was really interested in sex, particularly sex humor and folkloric treatments of sex. Legman fed Wertham's appetite for inside information, sending him lists of crime comics, explaining how comics changed titles but retained issue numbering, outlining suspicious business connections, and sharing reports of New York University professor Harvey Zorbah's workshops on comics. And that's Harvey Zorbah on the right. And he's really the inaugurator of the modern comic studies movement. For a period of years at New York University, he offered workshops, he did consulting, he published on comics, and he hosted several workshops as well. In the late 1940s, he invited Wertham to come speak at some of them, and Wertham always declined. But Stan Lee, the Marvel publisher, likely attended at least one of them, if not more. There were several comics folks who attended these workshops. It didn't take long for Wertham's work, together with a growing number of attempts to legislate the sale of comics, along with dozens of comics burnings and more, to get the industry riled up. Cities and municipalities promoted legislation that attempted to restrict the sale of certain comics to adults only. Groups like the National Congress of Parents and Teachers and the American Legion voiced their concerns about the deleterious effects of comics reading on kids. In the midst of all of this, one of the groups, the American Library Association, of which I'm a member and which is a co-sponsor of Banned Books Week, they said nothing during all of this. They never wrote a report. They never issued a statement. They were quiet through all of this. And in fact, some librarians, including a woman from Wisconsin who has one of my favorite articles from this time period, said that librarians, if they really cared, would go out and they would urge their legislators to support bans and restrictions on comics. So by late 1948, comics publishers felt compelled to create the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers, and this first code. It didn't have a lot of authority. Not every publisher belonged, including DC National didn't belong. But it was this first response, industry-wide, to concerns about comics. In 1950, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver reached out to Wertham. Kefauver was busy with investigating organized crime, and part of that investigation included comics, and so he asked Wertham to help him develop questions to ask comics publishers and distributors and creators. It turns out that not much happened as a result of that. Wertham was very disappointed. Kefauver got busy and wrapped up the report without doing much. Yet Wertham still testified in 1954 when comics returned to the Senate's purview. And even though Kefauver wasn't in charge of the 1954 committee, he was still part of it. I do want to point out, this is a lovely picture, and I'm sorry I don't have a better copy. This is the best copy I can find. This is from 1956, and this is Estes Kefauver when he was a vice presidential candidate. And that's his family around him, and those are his kids on his lap reading comics. So even though Kefauver put comics on trial popularly twice, his kids were still comics readers. And even though that was 1956, they were reading comics that were 2 or 3 years old. They were pre-code comics. So in April 1954, right after Seduction of the Innocent is released, the Senate is holding hearings on comics, and Wertham is there to testify along with people like Walt Kelly, the creator of the Pogo comic strip, who was then president of the National Cartoonist Society, and Bill Gaines, who was the publisher of EC Comics, Corey's Question. It was entertaining comics at the time, not educational comics. In the popular imagination of in our memory of the trial, Gaines was the whipping boy for the public's outrage about violence in comics. And you can see the photo of Kefauver, and he was holding up one of the notorious EC covers with the decapitated woman. And this is the image to which Gaines responded that he thought this was in good taste, that it would have been in poor taste had her head been held higher so that you could have seen the sinews and the blood. That didn't play very well. Gaines was young. He had inherited a struggling company, Educational Comics, from his father, who had passed away a few years earlier. And he had transformed what was a pretty banal set of comics titles into one of the most exciting, invigorating, respected slate of comics publications at the time. Books like crime suspense stories and weird fantasy. They had an avid readership from people, especially teen boys and 20-somethings, who really wanted something more in their comics reading than Men in Tights. What's less well remembered, though, about Gaines and the Senate hearing is that Gaines, around this time, published a series of editorials in his comics in which he invited readers of EC to share their views with the Senate. Gaines didn't care whether readers agreed with him or not. He just thought that the Senate needed to hear from actual comics readers and not just publishers and psychiatrists and juvenile justice folks. About 200 readers, many of them young people, wrote to the Senate subcommittee. And I want to read a letter from the summer of 1954 that one of these kids sent. To whom it may concern, I have for the past few months been urged by the editors of EC Comics to write to you about the recent comic book investigations. I had failed to do so because I thought it absurd that the US government would or could abolish harmless literature. But just yesterday, I learned that EC Comics is being forced to drop 5 of its publications because wholesalers and retailers throughout the country have been intimidated into refusing to handle crime and horror type comics. This is the type of thing that goes on in Russia, not in America. Of course, I realize that the reason for the stopping of this type of literature is to prevent juvenile delinquency. I have a collection of 85 ECs, which are supposed to be detrimental to the morals of the American youth, and yet I am as honest and clean as you would want your own son to be. I am speaking for the majority, the comic book readers, as opposed to the minority who have been so successful, the few disturbed parents. Sincerely, Brian E. Mulholland, age 15, Earlton, New Jersey. Now, I tracked Brian Mulholland down a couple of years ago. He had recently retired as a district attorney. That's him, as a young man. We talked for a while. He told me that he couldn't have written a better letter today as a grown-up with a law degree. I have this particular image from one of the EC Comics up here because after I turned off the recorder, we were still talking, and he said, you know, I was just talking with one of my sons, one of his adult sons the other day, and I was trying to explain to him about some of the comics I read, and he said, I was telling him about a story that I remember reading when I was maybe 13 or 14. And he goes on, and he spends about 5 minutes. I was so upset that I had turned the recorder off. He spent about 5 minutes describing panel by panel this story He couldn't remember what it was called. He didn't remember which EC comic book it was in. But he remembered the dialogue, he remembered the visuals, and 60 years after he read it, he hadn't read it since he was 13 or 14. 60 years later, he was able to remember Judgment Day. And I was pretty sure I knew what story it was as soon as he started describing it, but as soon as I got off the phone with him, I Googled and made sure that it was right. It had a profound and lasting effect on him. If you don't know the story, I hope you'll seek it out. It's a really powerful story about racism in the US. Now, the Senate subcommittee never acted on comics except to issue a report of the hearings. And bowing to public and governmental pressure, comics publishers created a new association, the Comics Magazine Association of America, in the fall of 1954. They didn't want the government to intrude on their publishing, so they did it themselves. They created a restrictive editorial code. Now, the editorial code that went into effect, the Comics Code, had a number of intriguing restrictions. Most notably, for Gaines, you couldn't have crime or horror in big letters on the cover of your comics anymore. That took care of most of Gaines's publications. Took care of a lot of others. But you also weren't allowed to do things like have vampires and werewolves and zombies. Robert Kirkman in The Walking Dead wouldn't be around if the Comics Code were still in effect. You couldn't have excessive violence. You couldn't have disobedient children. You couldn't show people with physical disabilities. You weren't really supposed to show women unless you just absolutely had to, and then you needed to be sure they had enough clothes on. You needed to watch out for bad grammar and slang. Those were worries too. The code persisted with modifications until the winter of 2011, so just a few years ago. Now, the code seemed to placate many people who were concerned about comics, except for Wertham. He was skeptical of the whole endeavor. The code eviscerated comics content, decimated the industry, and helped begin the long, painful decline in young people's readership. The code helped lead the way to fewer comics publishers and fewer comics titles and fewer comics readers, especially fewer kids reading comics. Now, there were other things going on too. As Nicholas pointed out, there was television. That was coming onto the scene. But the code and the panic and Wertham all helped contribute to this overall decline. Now, some of us might think that that's kind of a bad thing, but there were even some creators who thought it was a good thing that the code happened, that Wertham happened. Carl Barks, who was the longtime artist and writer for Donald Duck, told a fan in the late 1970s, quote, "Although much glory was heaped upon the quality of the Gaines output, I'm inclined to believe that the infamous book by Dr. Wertham was all that saved comic books from total destruction at the hands of the tasteless publishers of senseless gore. I know that many people argue that what children and grown-ups read does not influence their behavior. I wonder if those people ever heard of a book called the Bible or another called the Quran." Wertham died in 1981, and his papers made their way to the Library of Congress soon after that, but it wasn't until 2010, because of executors' wishes, that they were available to the public. And I've spent some time there now, not nearly enough, and I discovered some things, as Corey alluded to, that people didn't know. I think a lot of people had questioned Wertham's sensationalized rhetoric, his logical inconsistencies, the lack of documentation that you find in Seduction of the Innocent. But in looking through the original papers that he used to create the book and looking through the original manuscript materials, I discovered that he also asked kids leading questions. He altered their words. He knitted together their quotes in misleading ways. He omitted relevant details about young patients' lives that might affect how we understand them. And those are just some of the most egregious offenses. So I want to share a couple of examples. Here's how Wertham presented in full a patient named Vivian to readers in Seduction of the Innocent. A nice, friendly girl of 12 was brought to me by her mother because she had stolen some money from a lodger. She has a mind of her own, the mother said to me. It goes and comes. The teacher complains that she can't get any work out of her at times. Careful study of the girl over a period of time showed little that was wrong. A social worker asked the mother how the girl spent her time after school. Reading love comics, the mother replied. I have nothing against comic books, but she reads them all the time. This girl I found to be an expert on love comics. She told me she bought some, quote, but mostly I trade them. I asked her about stealing in love comics. She laughed. Oh, they do it often. A boy stole a bracelet from a girl he loves very much. He got caught, but she still loved him. He spent a term in jail. When he got out, he did it again and got sent up to jail again. The girl went to jail to see him, but she fell in love with another boy and got married. I'm going to quiz you on all of that after. This girl was full of such plots. It was hard to determine whether she had daydreamed more of loving or of stealing. The actual records for this patient that I found in Wertham's files tell a somewhat different story. Vivian visited one of Wertham's practices at least twice, perhaps only twice in the winter of 1951. Wertham may not have been the person who examined her. Vivian was 13, not 12. She was African American, and her teacher made the referral, not her mother. Her most recent report card was excellent, according to her mother, and Vivian played the piano beautifully. The girl may have stolen $1 from one of the lodgers. She may also have stolen a ring from her piano teacher. Vivian's mother reported that the girl was a liar. The report is only 2 pages long. But in it, we learn that Vivian's mother slapped her hard in the face, that her mother is actually her stepmother, that she had revoked Vivian's allowance. To me, the one sentence that stood out the most in this report was this. Mother says they want to put her in an institution. There was nothing about Vivian daydreaming, either about love or stealing. She did relate the convoluted story about a man going to jail for stealing a bracelet. It was the only story from comics that Vivian discussed. She told Wertham that sometimes, not often, people steal in love comics. Moreover, Vivian wasn't even an avid comics reader. She had been in the past, and she said that she read them if she had them. She bought them only occasionally. And her mother confirmed that Vivian was actually more interested in television than comics. Now, Wertham is popularly remembered as a source for the idea that Batman and Robin are actually lovers. Quote, a wish dream of 2 homosexuals living together. Now, there are lots I could say about this, but one of his sources of insight was purportedly a young gay man who arrived for therapy with a copy of Detective Comics, one of the titles that carried Batman and Robin stories. According to Seduction, this young man showed Wertham and his associates an image from the story that depicted Batman and Robin's domestic bliss and recounted his sexual awakening inspired by comics. I think I put myself in the position of Robin. I did want to have relations with Batman, he said. Now, in a move of what I see as authorial creativity, Wertham actually invented this young man. There were 2 separate individuals, 16 and 17. They had been in a mutual sexual relationship for several years. Wertham combined their statements. One of the kids said, the only suggestion of homosexuality in Batman and Robin may be that they seemed to be so close to one another. One of the boys told Wertham that they hadn't looked at Batman or Superman in a long time, but they had picked up a copy recently and found, quote, no homosexual suggestion in it. Wertham failed to mention that the 2 teens had actually found the Submariner and Tarzan, neither of whom had male sidekicks, along with bodybuilding magazines to be better subjects than Batman or Robin for their erotic fantasies. Wertham seemed to have genuine affection for the young people he treated in his clinics. But to my mind, he also seemed unable to trust them completely. That he changed children's words and altered their meanings in numerous instances as he built up his case against comics speaks to me of that lack of trust. Wertham feared the worst with comics, that too many children, their lives made precarious by poverty and abuse, would understand comics only in the same ways he did. That's the camera I was warned about. For Wertham, comics themselves were entirely suspect, without redemption, without merit. He wanted to protect kids and teens from his experience of comics. He didn't trust them as readers, to choose the texts that engage them, to take from comics whatever they needed, and leave the rest. And despite the distance of 60 years and documentary evidence of his wrong-headedness, we're still living with Wertham's legacy to some degree. The Comics Code is dead. Libraries, including Iowa City Public Library, collect comics. Comics are taught in schools and universities, and I'm lucky enough to teach a couple of courses. We encourage kids and adults to read comics. We've got great people creating amazing comics for readers of all ages. We recognize comics with awards, we throw big parties for comics, and people like me get invited to places like this to talk about comics. Still, part of my work is to help us recover and remember these stories about comic censorship in young readers. Mark Twain may have said that history seldom repeats itself, but it sometimes rhymes. And we have to be on the lookout for those rhymes. Comic censorship and less overt attempts to control access to comics is not a thing of the past. In Chicago this past year and in Oregon currently, there was an uproar about Persepolis. I've heard school librarians in my state of Illinois question whether they could purchase books like Raina Telgemeier's drama because it references homosexuality, and Ed Pisker's WYSIWYG because it addresses hacking. In the community where I live, a very liberal college community, public librarians have purchased books like Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbe's provocative Lost Girls, only to have administrators demand the book's removal before they even were placed on the shelves. And in South Carolina right now, there's a continuing fight over whether college students should be able to and allowed to read Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. Captain Underpants, the hybrid comic series by Dave Pilkey, which is incredibly popular, is the title most frequently challenged in the US. Wertham's legacy isn't just in the attempts to restrict readers' access to comics, it's also in people's views and perspectives on comics. I teach people who are going to be librarians, and I work with people who are librarians and teachers and parents. And I still hear, all too often, people express views that comics are juvenile, silly, violent, vulgar, less than, not real reading. And those ideas are part of Wertham's legacy, the legacy that's still with us. Now, I want to close with a portion of one final letter. Most of the several dozen kids who wrote to Wertham had only read the excerpt from the book, from the excerpt from Seduction that appeared in Reader's Digest. One teen read the whole book. And he was able to do that because he asked the librarian in his small Texas town if she would purchase a copy for the library, and she did. That teen was Bob Stewart, who you see in the photo. Some of you might know who Bob Stewart is. If you don't, he was a longtime comics fanzine editor, comics historian, writer, and he became my friend after I found this letter. Bob died a couple of months ago, but I want to share a portion of his letter to Wertham. He was 16 when he wrote it. Route 4, Kirbyville, Texas, June 5th, 1954. Dear Dr. Wertham, I finished Seduction of the Innocent yesterday, and there are a few points I would like to dispute with you. The first is your claim that the comic books have never had critics as all other modern-day literature and art forms have. I'm sending you a copy of Petresby, which was one of the fanzines he edited, which I edit and distribute to the fans of the Entertaining Comics group. Besides Petresby, there are about 3 or 4 other amateur magazines published for the purpose of providing EC with constant criticism. Then, too, these same fans of EC have established an interlaced correspondence system over the United States. You must admit that teenagers who have banded together to cuss and discuss the literate qualities of comic books are more than juvenile delinquents. Your claim that Batman is a homosexual is the most absurd thing in the entire book. The only person that would ever notice anything like that would be someone deliberately looking for pornography. I would think that environment plays a larger part than you've credited to it. All kids read comics, but only some are delinquents. Comic book artists don't aspire to draw for comics? Doc, there's nothing I want more than to draw for EC. The fact that you are against censorship is enough to make James rejoice, because once comics are outlawed out of existence, it'll only be a short step to the book burnings Bradbury science fictionalizes in Fahrenheit 451. Gotta go now. Quite a few other things on my hands, but a little soap and water will take it off. Sin? Question mark. Surely! Exclamation mark. Bob. Spoff on, Bob. Bless you, and thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was a wonderful lecture. I learned so much. And these young people write far better letters than I'll ever write in my entire life. So there's time for questions. If you have one, we are live on Library Channel 10, and I'll hand you the microphone. No questions?
So what library has the biggest comic book collection in the country?
Well, it depends on what kind of comic book collection you're interested in. So for academic study, Michigan State and Ohio State have 2 of the largest, but Iowa and Virginia Tech have growing comics collections. Public libraries, I'm not sure. There are big ones everywhere. So it just depends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was at the documentary,
Yes.
showing the documentary the other night, and there were a couple points that they made connections on that I hadn't thought about before, and there was Wertham's crusade, along with others. He was not alone.
Right.
And then there was the creation of the Comics Code, and then I think the documentary moved on and said, okay, the result of a lot of that was the superheroes of dominating comic books. I mean, Showcase number 4, I think, was published in 1955 with The Flash, and a whole generation of new comics. So, I mean, could it be said that this movement of criticism turned comic books almost exclusively into a superhero genre? I mean, they weren't exclusive, but they dominated it after that.
I think that was certainly a big push. I mean, there were still some romance comics and teen comics after that, as you suggested. It wasn't just superheroes, but I think superheroes were certainly safer than a lot of other genres and topics. But I also, and I'm not the only person who says this, I think one of the outcomes of all of this restriction was the underground comics movement. Because if you think about it, imagine you are 13 or 14 years old in 1954, and the thing that you love most in the world is being attacked, and it's being threatened to be restricted or censored or outlawed. And so the stuff that you love so much stays with you, and you begin to subvert it and turn it into something new and different. And so I do think that the superhero, the predominance of superheroes is one result, but I also think the underground comics movement of the 60s and 70s and the subsequent independent and alternative movements is also a result. I do think, though, if we hadn't had Wertham and the Comics Code and the Senate hearings and the other voices who spoke out against comics, I think we could have gotten maybe to 1986, the miracle year of comics, a little bit sooner. I think we would have seen a revitalization and a maturity in comics much sooner.
Hi. with the way Stan Lee and Marvel Comics and how you were saying underground comics, how they were reacting after a few years of the Comics Code, how they basically battled it without them knowing. Do you think it was destined to end where it did, or do you think it was actually a genuine threat from the beginning? Basically, if they hadn't done what they did, would the Comics Code still be around today? Even?
Well, by the time the Comics Code was retired in 2011, Archie and maybe DC were the only companies that were sending comics for review, and there was only one person who was looking at them at that point, and not really doing anything other than reading them and collecting a small paycheck. So the code didn't have a lot of force. The code began to have less force by the early 1970s when companies like Marvel and DC started pushing, and they were willing at times. Marvel, for instance, issued some comics without the code seal on the cover in order to say more grown-up things. So there was always this give and take and pushing against the code. But would it have happened the same way? Probably not.
Professor Tilley, I'm fascinated by what a meticulous note taker Wertham was. That he kept all of this material, even
You
the
have
material,
no idea.
even the stuff that seems to implicate him decades later. And I'm fascinated by the volume of children who were writing back to him. And I have a two-part question related to that. Was there any evidence that Wertham interacted with these children beyond copy editing? And do you think that this had anything to do with his later work on fanzines?
So there are only two instances that I can think of where Wertham engaged with kids who wrote letters to him. One was, and I'm just completely spacing, Robert Warshaw's son, Paul. Robert Warshaw was a cultural critic, and he wrote an article shortly after Seduction of the Innocent was published about his son reading comics. And there was a brief correspondence between Paul, who was 11, and Wertham. Paul asked for an autographed photo of Wertham. I don't know that Wertham sent him an autographed photo, but it was this short, little exchange. The other instance I can think of where Wertham engaged with kids, there was a girl who was in 8th grade in Bisbee, Arizona, who wrote on behalf of her 8th grade class. They were studying comics, and they were responding to one of Wertham's articles, and they sent him, this collective letter. And Wertham wrote back to them and asked some specific questions if they would talk about these things in class. And he also sent them a box of chocolates from Macy's. And I talked to Opal, the girl who wrote this letter, as class secretary, and she had no idea as an adult. She didn't really have any idea as a kid who Wertham was. And they were talking about comics sort of at the direction of her teacher, which she described her teacher as kind of this liberal, fun, older woman, but who had dyed her hair and was fairly progressive. And when the box of chocolates arrived, Bisbee at the time was a fairly poor community, and most of her classmates had never seen a box of chocolates before, and there was enough that each one of them got a candy. And she said that some of her classmates made their piece last the whole day because they were so excited by it. And they wrote back to Wertham, and I think he wrote to them, so there were like 2 exchanges, and that's it, as far as I know of him interacting with kids who wrote to him. Your other question, I've already forgotten.
About his later work on
Oh, yes, thank you. No, he didn't seem to connect with that. It's really weird. So Bob Stewart, for instance, sent him copies of his fanzines in the 1950s. I didn't find them in the collection, and Bob indicated to me that he had asked Wertham later in life about them, and Wertham claimed never to have seen them. So it seemed to be a different sort of response, for what it's worth. And yes, he was a meticulous note taker. Teresa?
That was really fabulous. That was really fascinating. And I think she turned it on. There's a little button on the bottom. Here.
Yep.
Here, we'll fix it. Sorry.
I think she can just hear you.
Well, they're recording.
Oh, I get you.
And they all want to know what I want.
What she's talking about.
Okay. I was saying thank you. That
Thank
was
you.
wonderful talk, and I learned a lot. But I'm really fascinated by all these children who are writing these letters.
Yes.
And I wondered, is that typical? And I mean, how would they even know how to enter this kind of conversation, how to contact him? Is this something you've seen in any other kind of situations?
I haven't. I've done a little bit of investigation on what letter writing was like at the time. So the best study of this were kids who wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s. And there's a book-length study of some of these letters that represents some of them. And there were some kids who were writing, but not, as a whole, I think this is really unusual. How they knew how to get in touch with him, that baffles me. But somehow they did. There were some kids who wrote really stupid and childish letters. I mean, I'm sharing with you some of the best ones. Some of them were just like, I think you're stupid, and if I ever see you, I'm going to, kill you if you take away my comics. And there were some that were riddled with misspellings, but some of the kids who were writing were 7 and 8 years old, which is also astounding. It's clearer to me how the letters to the Senate got there, because that was in the news more, and Bill Gaines was encouraging people to write. So it does seem to be unusual, but I'm glad that they wrote, and I'm glad that he saved the letters. I'm glad the Senate saved many of the letters. The other thing I want to note is that with the two exceptions I mentioned, Wertham didn't respond to kids, whether they agreed with him or not, and the Senate as a whole didn't acknowledge any of its correspondence. So I've talked to maybe 8 folks who wrote letters to the Senate. I've been able to track down them and interview them, and they all have said that I'm the first person who's ever acknowledged their letters that they wrote as kids. And they're astounded that they exist in the National Archives. So, Nick?
Okay, so this is a bit of lead-in, but one of the things I've noticed in my studies is that in order for comics fans and scholars to sort of keep the caricature of Fredric Wertham being sort of the supervillain in regards to comic books, they accidentally end up doing these sort of intellectual gymnastics to sort of ignore issues of gender and race. His argument that comic books promote a negative view of women, we would now look at that, especially in regards to work being done on video games, as, yeah, that is true. Having women parade around half naked in sexually provocative positions is intellectually demeaning to female consumers, and that's one of the things that video gamers are trying to change in some pockets of it. Same thing with race. Having only black characters with cornrows and criminal records is seen as, we now know that is racist. I'm curious to know if you could just comment on the fact that, to some extent, Wertham was right in his analysis of comic books,
Yes.
and how academics should properly thread that needle going forward.
That's a great question. And I think that it raises good points, that Wertham is often caricatured, and he shouldn't be. He was progressive in many respects. He was really engaged with the lives of kids, and as I said towards the end of the talk, I do think he had their best interest at heart, and I do think that some of his arguments about race and about sexual violence are on target. At the same time, there's an instance that I can think of right now that I talk about in the academic paper about this. It's a young girl, she was African American, and Wertham talks about how she would be a good, strong young woman if it weren't for her fascination with jungle comics and Wonder Woman, essentially. So these comics that featured half-naked women in somewhat violent sadomasochistic settings. But if you look at the case file for this young woman, there was a lot else going on. She was in a gang, she could barely read, she was living in extraordinary poverty, and she identified comics characters like Sheena as empowering. She saw this as a way for her to have a strong female role model to emulate. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and so I can't say if that's correct or not, if she would be better with Sheena as a role model or someone else. But that's who she found as that role model. Something else that came to mind? It'll come back to me.
I follow you on Twitter, so we
Well,
can
yeah.
have this discussion.
Yes.
Do we have any other questions? The battery has died on
Uh-oh.
this, so.
The dozens of people at home.
I can repeat questions.
Yes.
So I think we've got two, maybe. Oh, no, just you. Sorry.
Oh, well, what's your favorite comic book? And then what do you think about L. Ron Hubbard's effect on comic books, and what do you think about Drinky Crow? Have you ever read Drinky Crow?
I can't say anything about the last two because I don't know, and my favorite comic book changes by the day. And I mostly read small press stuff, but my favorite mainstream comic book right now is probably Hawkeye. And in terms of small press stuff or smaller press stuff, I like Princeless, which is a comic series for young people, primarily girls. And I'm a big fan of John Porcellino, who's an independent creator in the Chicago area.
I mean, like Drinky Crow gets drunk in his comic book every comic.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know,
But it's fun.
all of the R. Crumb stuff too. I really think there's a need to have a reason that there are so many kinds of comics and so many kinds of characters and stories and themes. Comics are literature
You know
like
who
anything else.
L. Ron Hubbard is.
Yes.
I mean, he wrote like a couple hundred comic books.
I can't help you out with that one.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I have one last
Sure.
question before we end. The slide you had up, a couple back, it was your Library of Congress one, and there was a picture of, there. Are you a comic hero? Is that you over there?
That is me over there. Actually, Corey, my secret identity is the Comics Crusader. And I didn't choose that, but my university decided to make a short documentary film about me. So you can watch it on YouTube. It's Carol Tilley Comic Book Crusader. And that's me with really big hands.
I think that's the perfect ending to our evening. Thank you.
Thank
Comic
you.
Crusader.